Today we are going to study a Mishnah together. As we've been doing the last while, we've been studying Mishnayos from Pirkei Avos. And it's very apt at this particular time of the year because this is the time of the year where we study Pirkei Avos. So not guaranteeing, of course, that we'll keep up to pace. In fact, there's no way that we'll keep up to pace because we're already behind. And there's not a chance that we're going to catch up anytime soon. So don't have that expectation that we're going to do this at the same pace that we're doing it on Shabbos. Where we are up to in this year is chapter 1, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Vav, Mishnah number 6. And just because we can, this is the wonderful thing about technology, I'm going to quickly put it on the screen just for a moment or two, so at least you have the text in front of you. It's right at the top of the screen, you can see there. Yehoshua ben Pirkei v'nitai ho'arbeli kiblu mehem. Remember that this is a period in history where what we're doing is, it's the development of Torah. And we're going generationally. And we're saying in this generation, the leaders were these people. And in the next generation, the leaders were those people. And that's pretty much how the first Perek works. The other chapters of Pirkei Avos don't necessarily follow as much of a chronology as this. But the first chapter definitely does. So we have these two individuals, Yehoshua ben Pirkei and Nitai ho'arbeli. They were the custodians of Torah in that next generation, and they in turn had received the tradition from the people we learned about in the previous Mishnahs, Yosef ben Yochanan and Yosef ben Yoezer. Again, every time that you have two people listed in the Mishnah, we assume the first one is, we don't assume, we know that the first one is what's called the Nasi. The Nasi was the more public figure. The Nasi was the person who was responsible for the entire generation. He was their spiritual leader. You could call him, if you wish, the ultimate sage and scholar and tzaddik of the time. And then the second person who is listed was the Av Beis Din. So he was the person who was in charge of the judiciary. Very often, and this is a good example, not always, but very often, the first character is much more well known. So Yehoshua ben Pirkei, as it turns out, is a lot more well known than Nitai ho'arbeli. In fact, you almost never hear about Nitai ho'arbeli, whereas Yehoshua ben Pirkei, the person that we're going to focus with today, is somebody who's fairly well known and actually, according to many opinions, was involved with a very important part of the history of the time. Here in this Mishnah, we call him Yehoshua ben Pirkei. In many other places, they call him Rabbi Yehoshua ben Pirkei. They give him the title. Generally speaking, people who are listed in the Mishnah without a title, it's done so as a compliment. That means to say that they were at such a high level that there really is no title that could capture their greatness. So Yehoshua ben Pirkei is one of those individuals. He's a very great person at the time. Now, Yehoshua ben Pirkei lived at a very tricky time in Jewish history. Very tricky. In fact, this whole period, already we saw it with the Antignos in Mishnah number 3. This whole period of the development of Judaism is fraught with a very serious underlying conflict. And that's the conflict between what was called the Purushim and the Tzedukim. Purushim are what you and I would be. In other words, Jews who are committed to the values of the Torah, both written and oral. Whereas Tzedukim, those are the people who rejected the oral Torah. For example, they would have rejected the Mishnah, and they believed in a literal reading of the scriptures, and their whole Judaism was built on that. So there was this split that happened at that time, and it was a very, very difficult period of Jewish history because you had people who were respected in the community, who everybody looked up to, and then one day they turned around and they switched sides. And probably the most infamous of those people was somebody called Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this previously, but the family of the Kohanim were unfortunately the most susceptible to the Tzedukim. The family of the Kohanim at the time of the Hanukkah story, just to give a little bit of context, at the time of the Hanukkah story, the Chashmonaim, who were the heroes of the Hanukkah story, the Maccabees, were a family of Kohanim. And at that time, they did something which was incredibly important and incredibly valuable. We know that. And they vanquished the armies of the Greek Seleucids. And Baruch Hashem, for them, they saved the day. And we have the holiday of Hanukkah. And that was great. Unfortunately, they made one little error. And the error that they made is after the war was over and they had reestablished sovereignty in Israel, they unfortunately then chose to create their own dynasty of kings. And that's inappropriate because the Kohanim are not supposed to be kings. The tribe of Yehuda are supposed to be the kings. So that was their little downfall. And a little mistake in their generation led to a greater mistake in the coming generations. And so it was the Kohanim, the Hashmonai dynasty, who very quickly became involved with the Tzedukim. So there was Yochanan Kohen Gadol, one of the most tragic stories of the period, a man who served as a dedicated high priest in the Beis HaMikdash for 80 years. And then he flipped and he became a Tzeduki and he rejected the oral tradition. And he became not only a Tzeduki, he was very connected. At that time, the political powers lay with the Tzedukim. So he had a lot of power, he had a lot of clout. And as a result of that, he persecuted some of the sages and some of the other Kohanim. Yehoshua ben Prachia was the leading sage and he was a Kohen. And he was one of the victims of all of this persecution. So he left. He left Israel and he settled in Alexandria in Egypt. Now, I know that that sounds like just an anecdotal piece of information. It's nice to have the historical background of the people that we're dealing with. But you will see that the fact that he lived in Alexandria of Egypt influences one of his major teachings that we're going to see in this particular Mishnah. Sometime later, there was a colleague of his who we'll read about in 2 Mishnahs from now called Shimon ben Shotach. And Shimon ben Shotach sent him a coded message that the danger had passed and that it was safe to come back to Israel. And that's how he eventually comes back and he becomes we're going to see exactly who he becomes. He becomes the teacher of an individual who there's some conflict as to exactly who the individual was. But either way, the individual that he becomes a teacher to is one of the most disturbed characters of Jewish history at that time. I say disturbed, obviously in a Jewish perspective. Okay, so with that kind of a background, we have a little bit of an insight into who Yehoshua ben Prachia was, the time frame that he lived in. Let's see what he has to teach us. Now, whenever we learn something in Pirkei Avos, we always have to be mindful of the fact that Pirkei Avos is specifically what we call Mili de Chasidusa, which means that the goal of Pirkei Avos is not to teach us Jewish law. The goal of Pirkei Avos is to teach us ethics, how to be a mensch, how to live beyond the requirement of the law. And so whatever it is that we learn in Pirkei Avos, we always have to have it against that backdrop. Why is this something that is beyond the requirement? Because very often the things that we read about in Pirkei Avos look to us as if they are the black and white bread and butter of Judaism. So we're going to do the same kind of thing over here as well. It teaches us 3 things. Yehoshua ben Prachia Omer. Bearing in mind, of course, that all of these sages taught much more than 3 things. But these are the 3 major things that jump out at us as the cardinal teachings of this individual. So what are Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachia's 3 major teachings? Number 1, Asay lecha rav. Please don't look at the English. It's very tempting, obviously, to look at the English. But the unfortunate thing about the English is that English is always written for the end user. So they kind of make it a little bit more flowery sometimes, and it doesn't necessarily give you the impact of what the Hebrew says. So Asay lecha rav. Make. I know it's a very simplistic word. Asay lecha rav. Make for yourself a rav. A rav is a rabbi, a master, a mentor. Any of those words would be an acceptable translation for the word rav. That's his first lesson for us. Asay lecha rav. Then he says, Ukenei lecha chaver, and acquire for yourself a friend. Just quickly to a quick play on words. So there was a story, and I've got to remember exactly, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was the Tzemach Tzedek, the 3rd Rebbe of Lubavitch, that his grandfather said to him, you should write stories that you hear, you should record everything that you learn, write and write and write. And he quoted this particular phrase, Ukenei lecha chaver, vekoneh, he just revoweled it, koneh is a quill, koneh lecha chaver, let the quill become your friend. So for all those people who like to write notes during a shir, this is your Mishnah. Koneh lecha chaver, let the pen be your friend. Okay, so lesson number 2 is, Ukenei lecha chaver, acquire for yourself a friend. Lesson number 3, always judge people favorably. Kaf zechus in a literal sense means, if you can imagine a scale, and the scale has two kapois, it's got two areas that you put the weights or whatever it is into. So kaf zechus, always judge people and put them on the side of merit. Okay, so those are his three lessons. Make for yourself a rabbi, a mentor, a master, acquire a friend, and judge everybody favorably. So our job, obviously, is to try and understand what all of these things mean. And our job is to try and understand specifically the following questions. Number one, why are these three lessons what we call being a mensch? Surely, at least the first one is part and parcel of being Jewish, right? Isn't that part and parcel of being Jewish? Have a rabbi. That's not higher grade. That's not advanced Judaism. That's basic Judaism. Make sure you have a rabbi. How else are you supposed to learn? Is that not part and parcel of the very fundamentals of being Jewish? That's number one. Question number two. What do you mean, kenei lecha chaver, acquire a friend? What are you supposed to do? Buy friends? Yes, we all know people who are like that. They think they can buy friends. We all know people, they're going to give you gifts and they're going to treat you and they're going to take you on trips and who knows what they're going to do. And that way they believe they're going to buy your friendship. Surely that is antithetical to Judaism. You don't buy friends. You invest in friends. You make friends. You reach out to friends. You sacrifice for friends. You show love to friends. Very unusual expression. Number three, judge every person favorably. Is that higher grade? Is that not basic Judaism? Do we not have a principle in Judaism that says, love your fellow Jew as yourself? Now, surely, what does it mean, love your fellow Jew as yourself? I know everybody always says, well, first you've got to love yourself. Yes, okay, we know that. But what does it mean, love your fellow Jew as yourself? So you might remember the very, very renowned story. There was a person, he wanted to convert to Judaism, and he wanted to have the executive summary of what the whole of Judaism is all about. So he went and he knocked on the door of the famous sage Shammai, who we're going to get to in a few Mishnahs' time. Shammai says to him, well, you mad? I mean, he didn't say those words, obviously. But Shammai says to him, you cannot summarize the whole of Judaism. He says, teach me the whole Torah while I stand here on one foot. He's like, oh, I can't do it while you stand here on one foot. It's not possible. And Shammai shoos him out of his room. So the prospective convert goes down the road and he goes to Hillel. He says to Hillel, teach me the whole Torah as I stand here on one foot. And Hillel says this, Ma da'aloch soni lechavroch lo savid. What you would hate to have done to you, don't do to somebody else. Zehu kol ha-Torah kula ve'idach pirushahu. This is the whole of Torah and everything else is commentary. So, what do you mean judge somebody favorably is midas chasidus? It's beyond the requirement of it's not beyond the requirement of the law. That is the whole of Judaism, isn't it? Isn't the whole of Judaism, don't do to somebody else what you wouldn't want done to them? Don't you want people to always judge you favorably? Don't you always wish that people would just give you the benefit of the doubt? And when there are rumors swirling around or somebody has a faribel or whatever, don't you just wish that they would judge favorably? Of course, we all do, right? That's what we all want for ourselves. So that should fit squarely within an instruction that the Torah gives, love your fellow Jew as yourself. Why is it in the specific context of beyond the letter of the law? One final question. There are other questions as well. Sorry, two more questions. There are others. We'll focus on two more questions. The flow doesn't seem to really flow. Make yourself a mentor and acquire a friend. You can see the correlation. It's basically telling us the kind of healthy structure that a person should have around them in order that they have the right kind of influences, right? That's what it is. Have a good teacher, have a good mentor, have a good friend. That's going to keep you in a healthy space and environment that will be conducive to your personal development. How does judging somebody favorably fit into this conversation? That should surely be a different category for another time. In other words, this Mishnah sounds very much like it's talking about how you should care for yourself spiritually. And a different conversation should be, and once you are in a good, healthy spiritual position, we can advise you on how you should treat other people as well. And then the final question that we'll deal with over here today is, why Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachia, of all the sages that are out there, why was he specifically the person who resonated with these three teachings more than any other rabbi? Okay, so that's what we're going to try and decode during the course of the time that we have together today. Let's see how good a job we could do of this. We'll start at the beginning with Asay L'Chol Rav. Let's start with that, because remember right at the beginning I said don't look at the English. The reason for that is because let's focus on this word Asay, make a rabbi. How do you make a rabbi? You don't make a rabbi. The rabbi is already made. The rabbi comes, the mentor comes, already made. All you need to do, it should have said, is accept the rabbi, right? Or appoint the rabbi. Go have that meeting, sit down with so-and-so and say, I'd like you to be my Rav. I'd like you to be my spiritual mentor. What do you mean make? It's a very unusual expression. Make a rabbi. So we have an expression, a very interesting expression. You're going to love this, by the way. You're definitely going to love this one. And I can be absolutely guaranteed, under ordinary circumstances, the shiur is in the morning, and then you have to wait till the evening, till your husband comes back from work, and then you can tell him like the real bad news of what you learned this morning. The advantage here is that it will be fresh in your memory. You can go and tell him, you see, this is what the Torah says. So there's a very disturbing phrase in the Gemara. The Gemara says, Eizo hi isha kshera. Who is a good wife? Ha'oisa retzoin baila. A wife who does the will of her husband. And you can be absolutely sure that at some point your husband heard this quote. And he may never have shared it with you, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he's pretty conscious of this. That what's an isha kashera? What is a good wife? A wife who does what her husband wants. That is what we call pshat. That's what you call taking things at face value. But I have good news for you. You don't have to take things at face value. Because that word, oisa, that she does, which is the same word as we have over here, asay, make, is very closely associated to this phrase. The phrase that we also have in the Gemara, me'asin al hatzedakah. Me'asin. It's the same root. It's just got the mem at the beginning. Me'asin al hatzedakah means that we are entitled as a community to force people to give tzedakah. So of course, anybody will tell you, it's my prerogative. If I choose to be generous, then I can give. And if I choose not to be generous, what could you do about it? Well, actually, we can do quite a lot. Me'asin. The community has authority to apply pressure to somebody. And by the way, that pressure includes all kinds of methods, which we're not going to get into now. But it is possible for the community to apply pressure to somebody to force them to give tzedakah. The word asiya, doing, has an underlying message of doing with force or being forced in order to do. So let's go back to the Gemara about the good wife. Eizohi isha kashera. Who is a good wife? Ha'oisa ritzoin baila. A woman who is able to make her husband's will. Oisa implying that she's able to, in a healthy way, pressure her husband to want the right things. That's actually what it means. Oisa ritzoin baila. She puts some kind of pressure or some kind of leverage onto her husband that his ratzon, that his will should be for the right things. Yehoshua ben Prachia, the Gemara tells us in Menachos, never wanted to be a leader. It wasn't his thing. So much so, he actually made quite a radical statement. He used to say, if anybody would ever tell me that I should become a leader, a rabbi, he says, I would feed them to the lions. How's that for rabbi, we want you to be the rabbi. I'll quicker throw you to the lions. That's what he said. Anyhow, it didn't work. And they managed to get him to be the leader. not only a rabbi of a community, he became the Nasi, the spiritual and central leader of the entire Jewish people at that time. Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia said after that, he said, you know what? Now that I've tasted what it is to be a leader, if anybody would try and take it away from me, I would pour an urn of boiling water over their head. In other words, what he was illustrating is that sometimes the leader has to be pushed. Asay lechorav. Sometimes, in fact, often, if you look through Jewish history, we can use Moshe as a really good example of this. The people who are appropriate to be the leaders are hesitant. They don't want to necessarily be leaders. To us, that's actually a good sign. That's the fundamental difference between Jewish leadership and politics. How does politics work? Somebody gets up and lectures you for a year or whatever amount of time it is, why they are the best person to lead you. And then the minute you believe them and you vote them in, then they spend the next 4 years showing you why that was a mistake. But in Jewish leadership, the leader doesn't want to be the leader. The leader says, I'm sure there's somebody else who's better suited. I'm sure there's somebody else who has better qualifications, somebody else who appreciates the needs of the community more acutely than I do. Look somewhere else. You don't want to be a leader. You're probably the person who needs to be a leader. In other words, the reason we looked at you in the first place is because we saw qualities that you have: wisdom, insight, leadership ability, a way of connecting, empathizing, whatever it is. We've seen all of this value within you. Now the cherry on the top is that you don't want to be the leader. Asay lechorav. We're going to leverage, we're going to apply pressure. Dafka, the kind of person who does not want to be the leader, is that in itself is a good sign that that person should be a leader. But that's not the end of the story, you see. That's not the end of the story. Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia was telling us something very profound over there. Yeshua ben Prachia says, I'm going to share with you my own experience. My own experience is I didn't want to become a leader. It wasn't my thing. It wasn't attractive to me. In fact, it was so objectionable to me that I would rather have thrown you to the lions. That was my original perspective, he says. Then I landed up becoming a leader. They tell a story. The first Rebbe of Chabad, Rebbe Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe, had a particular chassid who was an absolute giant. Absolute giant. And his name was Rebbe Isaac of Hommel, what they call today Gomel. He was an incredible giant. And the Alter Rebbe told him, every single person has their specific path in life. Every person, your soul has come into this world to fulfill a very specific mission. And that's where you will fly. That's where you will develop the best. So the Alter Rebbe said to him, there's one thing you have to know in your life. Never become a Rebbe. Now, Rebbe Isaac of Hommel never intended to become a Rebbe. It wasn't an aspiration that he had. He was a very dedicated chassid of his Rebbe. It was never on the agenda. But years went by, the Alter Rebbe passed away, and there was a particular group of chassidim, and they also lost their Rebbe. And they were canvassing. They were trying to find somebody who could lead them. They felt the void. And they knew that Rebbe Isaac of Hommel was a very great man. He was a tremendous scholar. And they felt that he's the guy. So they approached him. And he said no, because he remembered the Alter Rebbe told him, don't become a Rebbe. So he turned them down. And they persisted. And he turned them down. And they persisted. And they turned them down. And eventually, he said, you know what, at least I'll come to your town and I'll meet the people. And I'll explain to you why I can't do this particular job. So they sent him a beautiful carriage to bring him to their town, the kind of honor that they would have given to their Rebbe. And the carriage arrives in his house, and he gets on board, and he starts going to the town. And 5 minutes into the journey, Rabbi Isaac Hommel, who at that point was not a young man, flings the door of the carriage open, and he jumps off the moving carriage, injuring himself. And of course, they're completely, the representatives from the other town are completely shocked. They stop the carriage again. Well, what happened? What happened? He says, I can't come with you. I can't come with you. The Alter Rebbe told me that I cannot become a Rebbe. And he explained to them, he says, you don't understand. The minute I stepped into that carriage and started to head in the direction of your town, where you had the expectation of me becoming your Rebbe, suddenly my mind opened. Suddenly I had a perception of Judaism and a perception of God that I'd never had before. It was the most incredible experience. And it was suddenly very lucrative to become a Rebbe, because when you become a leader, you're endowed by Hashem with new energy and new insight and new abilities. So it was so powerful. And then I remembered, but I was told that's not my path in life. I should not become a Rebbe, and I had no choice, because I knew if I didn't jump out of the carriage at that moment, I would not be able to resist. Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia says a similar thing. He says, before I became a leader, I wasn't interested in the extreme. I didn't want it to the point that I literally would have thrown you to the lions. He says, but once I became a leader and I was endowed with all these special blessings that Hashem gives, then I suddenly had a totally different perspective. I said, I wouldn't give this up for the world. But I also came to realize, when you reach that stage, you know how dangerous it is? You know how dangerous it is for a person to reach a point in their life where everybody else looks up to them and everybody else wants to learn from them. And you could now fall into the trap of thinking, I don't need anybody to guide me, because look at me, I'm guiding everybody else. Surely if Hashem has entrusted me with the well-being of the entire community, I'm good. I'm at the top of the pyramid. Therefore, Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia, pulling on his own experience, said, there are times in a person's life where the Torah may not require that you have to have a rabbi. The Torah may not require that you have to have a mentor, because you're actually learned yourself, and possibly even the most learned of everybody in your sphere. Everybody in your family, everybody in your community, you are the top person. And you might easily be able to justify yourself and say, well, the Torah does not expect me now to have to call on anybody else to guide me. Therefore, he says, I say, force yourself. I say is a powerful word. Force yourself to have a rabbi. Force yourself to always have a mentor. Never allow yourself to be in a position where you trust yourself implicitly. No matter if you are the wisest, the most respected, the greatest leader, it's irrelevant. Asay lechorav. Apply the pressure to yourself to ensure that you will always, regardless of your stature, have a mentor. It's an incredibly powerful lesson in leadership. The worst kind of leader is the leader who believes that they're at the top of the pile. And the best kind of leader is the leader who says, I could still learn something from somebody else. Like you'll see Rashi sometimes comments on the Chumash, I don't know the interpretation of this verse. Or like you'll see Moshe Rabbeinu, when Pinchas got up to take the law into his own hands, where Moshe was able to say, I was wrong in this particular case. Or with the daughters of Tzedakah, when they said, what about us? You've told us the laws of inheritance, but how does that apply to somebody who has no sons? And Moshe says, I didn't know the law, you have taught me. That's true leadership. Asay lechorav. It's not a requirement of Judaism, but it is certainly an aspiration of Judaism. Now the question is why? Why is that so important? And to appreciate why that is so important, we've got to go a little bit back in history, because you remember that there was a major controversy that happened during the time of the prophet Shmuel, and the controversy was around the Jews wanting to have a king. Basically what happened is the Jews come to Shmuel, he's the prophet at the time, and they say, please appoint a king over us. And Shmuel has a total freak out. You've rejected me, you've rejected Hashem, this is inappropriate. What was Shmuel so upset about? It is a positive commandment in the Torah, in Parashas Shoftim, that when the Jews live in Israel, they should appoint a king. So what is wrong with what they wanted? They were following the Torah. Why was Shmuel so upset? And then he tells him, you don't understand what it's going to be to have a king. He's going to take your daughters for his harem, and he's going to take your sons for his army, and he's going to take your fields for his treasury. And he makes it sound like the most terrible thing. And then 2 years later, King David is the king, and it's the biggest mitzvah, and it's the biggest celebration. What does this mean? One minute it's horrible to want a king, the next minute it's the most celebrated thing, and it's a dynasty that's going to stretch all the way to Mashiach. So the answer to that is very simple. They said we want a king, kachol hagoyim, like the rest of the nations. A king who will give us prestige. A king who will make us a nation among nations. A king that will make the rest of the world say, you people are a secular nation too. You've also got your structure and your hierarchies, as we do. And that's exactly the opposite of what a king is, or any leader, or any mentor in Judaism. A king, a leader, and a mentor is asay, somebody who is going to impose things on you that are not easy for you to accept. Somebody who's going to put you into a position that you will have to challenge yourself and have to consider things that are uncomfortable, and that you will have to be willing to relinquish your own ideas or your own aspirations in favor of what this leader teaches you Hashem wants from you. The kind of king that they were asking for was a king who was going to make their life nice and comfortable and exciting. The kind of king that the Torah said that you should have is the kind of king who lives with no sense of their own ego and is completely dedicated to whatever Hashem wants. So therefore, whatever they tell you to do is what Hashem wants, not what feels good. Asay l'chorav. Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia is telling us, it doesn't matter how wise you are, how learned you are, how developed you are, how spiritual you are, you always have to have somebody in your life who you look to and you say, that person, I believe, is so dedicated to Hashem that they'll be able to guide me to do what Hashem wants, not what I feel, or not what looks popular, or not what they believe will make me respect them more. That's the kind of a Rav that I need to be looking for. Somebody who can be objective, honest, and truly dedicated to the cause. No, that's not required by Jewish law. That level of perfection is not required by Jewish law. That's why it's in Pirkei Avos. It's an aspiration. It's what a Jew should be looking for beyond the requirement of the law. Phase 2, Kenei lecha chaver. See, phase 1, he's told us that in order to be a wholesome person, I have to have somebody above me who I look up towards. Phase 2, if I want to be a wholesome person, I have to have somebody who's within my plateau, who's within my reality, who is part of where I live, not somebody who I connect with through respect, somebody who I connect with through love. Kenei lecha chaver. Well, we understand exactly what that means, to buy something. To buy means that I take some of my resources and I spend those resources on this object or this experience. Kenei lecha chaver means that I invest in that friendship. I invest in that person. I don't just say, you'll be nice to me, I'll be nice to you, we'll have coffee together, we'll share good times, and please God, if it stays that way, we'll be friends, and if it doesn't, well, maybe the friendship will expire and I'll move on and go to somebody else. Kenei lecha chaver. You have to invest. You have to invest in that chaverschaft, in that sense of friendship. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia landed up living in Alexandria. So the Mishnah in Machshirin tells us that there was a story about Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia. It's a very technical issue, so I don't want to get into the technicality of it, but the simple understanding is this. In order for something that grows naturally to become susceptible, to become tamei, impure, there are 2 steps that are required. Number 1, it must now no longer be growing, so it has to have been harvested. And after having been harvested, it had to, at one point, at any time, even if it is currently not in that state, it had to be wet by one of a series of different liquids that the Torah says would be machshir, that would make it susceptible to impurity. Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia said that because of the situation of how the crops were stored in Alexandria of Egypt, he wanted all Jews throughout the whole world to modify the way that their produce would become susceptible to impurity. And the rabbis didn't accept this. The rabbis said that that's your experience, that's Alexandria, it's a different climate, it's a different storage system. We're not going to impose it on the rest of the Jewish world. And that becomes the law in practice. But the message over here is that Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia believed that the experience of one Jewish community should become the shared experience of the rest of the Jewish world. There should never be something like an isolated segment of the community. And by extension, there should never be something like an isolated individual within the community. So is that required by Jewish law? No. What's required by Jewish law? If I'm engaged with a particular Jewish person, I have to show them love. If there's some person out on the periphery who I don't actually have any connection with, and their circumstances are totally different to my circumstances, why would I have to go and not just help them, but modify my life to accommodate them? That's Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia's teaching. His attitude to life was, you have to invest. That means you actually have to step outside of yourself and try and create chaver, a sense of community. Chaver comes from the word chibur, a sense of connection between people and communities who, by rights, actually have nothing to do with each other. And by rights, their circumstances are completely distinct from each other. And by rights, what's going on in the one community should not have an impact on what's going on in the next community. You're right, that's all true. But my attitude is we should push ourselves beyond what the law requires. And we should try and find a way that everybody is able to operate in a system, in a circle that accommodates everybody, that brings everybody into a sense of cohesion. It's an incredibly high ideal. It's not just about having one friend and being nice to that friend. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia tells us there's an attitude you have to take to those who are greater than you. Asay l'chorav. There's an attitude you have to take to those who are on a par with you. Kenei lecha chaver. And then there's the attitude you have to take towards the person who is lower than you. The person who you believe is not as good as you are. The person who you believe is lazy or not spiritual or neglects their responsibilities or is rebellious or whatever it is that to you places them at a lower rung of the ladder than you are. And now you can see the flow through all three of them. He's talking, it's a little similar to the prophecy of Yeshaya Hanavi about the seraphim, that they have 6 wings, 2 that cover their face, 2 that cover their legs, and 2 that they use to fly. And the mystics explain what that means is 2 that cover their relationship with Hashem, who is higher than them. They have to cover their face because Hashem is higher than them, and they have to show submission to Hashem. 2 that relate to those who are lower than them, the beings that are lower than them. Cover their legs so that you don't look disparagingly at those who are lower than you. And 2 to fly, to allow you to operate effectively in the reality where you live. Now, Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia, as I mentioned at the beginning, had a student who was a very troublesome individual. The Gemara calls him Oisoi Ha'ish, that individual, which is quite obviously, just a little bit cryptic. Who is that individual? And so there are 2 versions. According to the Tosfos, that individual applies to some kind of a rebel who existed at that particular time, and we don't necessarily know their name. But many of the other commentaries say that the individual it's referring to is somebody we affectionately in the Jewish world today called Yoshka, founder of another entire religion, an apostate Jew, really, if you think about it, student of Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia. And the Gemara tells us 2 stories about the interaction between Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia and this particular individual. The one story is fairly well known and the other story is not so well known. So I'll start with the first story, even though it happened second. The story goes like this, that this particular student had a major fallout with Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia. And there were various occasions where he approached Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia and said, please accept me again as a student. And each time Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia pushed him off and said, no, not suitable. And the intention that Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia had was that he wanted this particular individual to really, really mean it. So similar to what we would do with a convert, you keep pushing them off and pushing them off. Eventually, it came that critical moment where this particular student, who, like I say, many of the commentaries define as being Yoshka, otherwise known as JC, otherwise known as, the guy that has a couple of hang-ups. So eventually he gets to the point, it's breaking point, and he says, this is it. I'm trying one last time, and if he accepts me, good, and if he doesn't, that's it. And he approaches Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia was in the middle of the Shema. Now, bear in mind, in those days, there were no Sidurim, so you couldn't see where he was in the davening. He was sitting there, and he was mumbling words. So he did the universal, I should say, the Israeli sign. The classic Israeli sign for Savlanut, right? 1 second. like a classic Israeli, right? What, 1 second. So he gives him the sign, and the student misunderstood the sign, and he thought he was telling him, get lost. And he went off, and the expression that the Gemara uses is zokaf levena, which is basically an expression to say that he then began to engage in paganism. So those who say it was Yoshka, that's when he went and he decided to start his own movement. Based on that version of the story, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachya became highly sensitive to how careful you need to be with those people who you look at disparagingly, because for good reason. This was a rebellious student. The Gemara tells another story about him, that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachya and this particular student had once gone together. They were traveling and they landed up staying in an inn, and the woman who was the innkeeper was incredibly, incredibly good to them. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachya said, wow, look what a beautiful woman she is, meaning to say what beautiful character she had. And this particular student said, yes, but she has funny eyes. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachya said, that's what you suspect me, that's how I looked at her, that you suspect me? That was looking. So he was a troublesome student for a long time. But now seeing how things panned out, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachya became highly sensitized to the way you should always look at a person who is a troubled person, who is, in your view, lowly, who in your view is not behaving as they should. Therefore, he says, when it comes to looking at the person who's lesser, dan lekaf zechus, always find a way to judge them favorably, which he didn't do in that particular incident. He was upset at his student, and he said, how could you have suspected me of looking at that kind of thing, which wasn't even what the student had said. But there's another lesser known story of their interaction, which also feeds directly into this particular discussion. Much less known story. One day Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachya goes, this is after his student has now rejected Judaism and gone off on a pagan path and started his own movement and whatever. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachya goes over to him and he says, Chazor b'cha, do tshuva. Do teshuva. Now, let's picture this for a second. You're going to an individual who at that time had a multitude of followers. Yes, of course, we know that, assuming that it was in fact Christianity, we know that Christianity only really took off years later. But he still had a following. Can you imagine going to the leader of a particular cult movement and saying, do teshuva, come back home? That's what he did. He goes and he says, Chazor b'cha, do teshuva. So this fellow turns to him and he says, look, Rabbi, you know as I know that I learned in your yeshiva and I know what the Torah says. And I know that the Torah says, Hachoite umachti es harabim, that a person who not only sins in their private capacity, but is directly responsible for many other people sinning, such a person can never do teshuva. Why are you wasting your time with me, Rabbi? I'm a lost cause. I'm far gone. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachya says, nevertheless, Chazor b'cha, do teshuva as anyway. Yeah, I know what it says. I know exactly what it says. Do teshuva anyway. Why did he say that? So in the book of Tanya, the magnum opus of Chabad, it says this. It says, if a person says, the Gemara in Yuma tells us, if a person says, I'm going to sin now, knowing that later I'll just fix it by doing teshuva, so Hashem does not give that person the opportunity to do teshuva, which basically sounds like the door is slammed in your face. And the reason, the logic is quite simple, because the teshuva became part of the sin. Your motivation to sin was your reliance on teshuva. So how can the teshuva now help you get out of the sin? It's part of the sin. So on that topic, the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, the first Chabad Rebbe writes in Tanya, that the expression of the Gemara is ein maspikin. They don't allow the opportunity to do teshuva. But if you push in an incredible way, if you show immense remorse, like the famous story of Elazar ben Durdaya that the Gemara tells us sinned with every possible sin that was available in Israel at the time, and eventually overnight had an awakening and decided to do teshuva, and the Gemara says that he went straight to Gan Eden literally overnight. Why? Because if you push hard enough, You can always do teshuvah under any circumstances. Why did Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia go back to his student who had rejected everything and started a new cult and still tell him to do teshuvah? Because he was done lekaf suchus. Because he had taught himself to judge somebody favorably, and so he judged his student as a person who probably could still push hard enough to actually do teshuvah. And that's why he figured it was his responsibility to offer him that opportunity. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia teaches these 3 lessons because all 3 of them were very personal to him in his own life. And the 3 lessons in summary are, you should always have somebody in your life who you look up to, and that individual, I say, whatever they tell you to do, you will do with absolute submission and compliance. You should always look horizontally at those around you and try as best as you can to bring everybody together in the most wholesome way. And when you have to look at those who you believe are lower than you, find a way to look at them favorably. We do know that the toxicity of Lashon Hara, why is Lashon Hara so bad, is because when you speak negatively about somebody, it actually brings whatever negative they had beneath the surface to the fore. If you judge somebody favorably, you bring whatever positive they have within themselves that they didn't even necessarily know that they had, you bring it to the surface. So never underestimate the value of looking at somebody with a kind eye, looking at somebody with a positive spin, trying to see the positive in them. You could save their life quite literally. Very, very powerful Mishnah. Definitely something to apply and to think about.